Hello everyone, welcome back to the August edition of Angular Singapore monthly meetup. So on today's meetup, we are welcome Neil to join us and talk about NgRx. But before we jump into the talk, let's go through some quick introduction about Angular Singapore and some community here in Singapore about the tech. So the agenda for today is like we just have the casual chats before the talk, and then now is the introduction, and then with that we will just go into the talk. After the talk, usually we have some spare time for Q&A, and you have the open announcement, and basically you can come in and say hello, or you have any job advertisement or anything. The open announcement is for everyone. You can come and say. The code of conduct is quite simple. I think I just put a slide here, but basically we have the speaker to join us. We have other, so just be nice to other. And I hope we will have a fun meetup today. So the next meetup is going to be on the 7th of September in the same time at 7 p.m. Singapore time zone. We try to organize the meetup on the first Tuesday of the month. So you don't see us like posting on Twitter. Basically, it's never happened before. So far, we have a meetup every month, and we have the discussion on Discord. I will send the link on the chat to you guys. So if you feel like you wanted to, have some question or discussion, just come in. We also do some announcement through Discord. We have some content posting on YouTube. I will also upload the recorded talk today on YouTube after the talk, maybe just a few hours. And one initiative that we started is like if anyone have any question or needs some advice on basically anything, just feel free to get a meetup, like a quick meeting with us. So usually it's 15-minute chat, but it could get a bit longer, depend on your problem, your advice that are required. If you wanted to speak with Angular Singapore, just send the talk to the Twitter, and we'll get back to you. Or if you are the community member of Angular Singapore and you wanted to bring other speaker to our channel, feel free to drop me a message as well. I'll try my best to get the speaker to come and join us. Before we move on, I wanted to mention about Angular Nation. So basically, we are here doing Angular. So Angular Nation is just a place for us to talking Angular all day, I would say. So there's a lot of group, and we have different events for different time zone. So if you are staying in APAC area, you have the event for APAC. In South Asia, in Europe, and in America as well. The upcoming is quite interesting. I think next one is tomorrow. We talk about the standalone component SPI with Alex, the one who created the PR. So it's going to be very exciting. If you like to join, just go to angularnation.net and get an account. All of the free event here is free for everyone. Just come in and you can see it. Basically just if you have some spare time, come in and join and have a chat with people. There's some costs, there's some free costs, and I was learning a lot from that. Like I was following the IHS basic just to get my knowledge refreshed after some time working with Angular. But there's more as well, so you can go in. Most of them are free. There's a few premium costs, and there's a bit of fee on top of that, but I think it's gonna worth it. I just recently started collaborating with Google developers in Singapore. So it's just the centralized places to host all of the events from for engineer and startup in around the region, like APAC region. In Singapore, the tech community is quite happening. There's the Singapore JS, there's a few more other groups. There's Junior Dev JSG, there's a Talk CS, React JS SG, and now we have Angular Singapore. Actually, there's more, but that is still all of the some of the IT group based on my knowledge. And we are very close to the end of the introduction. So the etiquette is, if you have some question, maybe just write down so that you don't forget. And during the Q&A, feel free to unmute yourself to speak about your question and get the answer from speaker or from the other people. We encourage people to speak. And if you don't feel like comfortable to speak in front of people, just type the question into the chat. We will help you to interpret it. And with that, let's go into the talk. So the talk today is about NgRx, which is the reactive state management for Angular. So the speaker today will join us is Neil. He is the freelance software engineer, trainer, founder, and a self-published author. I think one of his most famous book was the NgRx book. So that is just it's a good pair when he's talking about NgRx today. He's been I think he's also been playing a lot of ukulele and try not to hurt himself when playing skateboard, if I'm not mistaken. So welcome Neil into our meetup today. But as recently introducing, there is the small part for you. So it is the question for you before we jump into all of the technical stuff. It is actually still the same question following the previous meetup. So the question for you today is, do you have to delete all but keep 3 apps on your smartphone? Which one would you keep and why did you keep that?
Good question. I hope you can hear me well. Otherwise, just interrupt me and tell me if something is off. So my connection might be a bit whoopy today. All but 3 apps. So the first one that came to my mind was a little game where you can just fight round-based against in a multiplayer match. So a bit weird, but I play that one all the time. Okay. The next one that came to my mind would be Twitter, but then I thought, yeah, maybe that's something I should delete first. So it's a good distraction, but I love to connect through Twitter with others from the community and just see new stuff coming up in the tech community. So probably keep Twitter then. And another one I should keep would probably be my calendar. So I don't miss meetups, right? So this one was in my calendar and I would have missed this if I didn't have the calendar. So I'd keep this one too.
Yes, thank you. I will also keep the calendar, but Twitter, I don't even have it on my phone. But that's how I
might be a good idea.
But that's how we connected anyway. But yeah, it's like you can always use the web. Yeah.
Yeah, we connected via Twitter. Yeah, so I keep that definitely.
Yeah, thanks. With that, I hand it over to you and let's get started with the talk today.
Yeah, I tried sharing my screen, so I might have to turn my camera off. I don't know about my connection. I'm on vacation, so let's see how this works. I'll just share my entire screen here. Should have lost me that? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. So I've fallen in love with this tool called Excalibur. So it's an open source drawing tool. If you don't know it, try it out. And it totally corrupted me. So I didn't even really prepare slides. Instead, I've drawn just my thoughts up into this whiteboard tool. Don't worry, I think I'll get these into slides once it's done. But for now, I just prepared this talk so we can go through some drawings, bits of code here and there, so you can see how NgRx looks in code. And so NgRx is the main title here. Subtitle would be Reactive State Management for Angular, but in general, I've prepared this little journey on how you might progress in state management with Angular. So different things that might come up, different solutions to problems that you're facing when you manage in state and Angular applications or web applications in general, software in general. And we'll just see how we can end up using NgRx and how the NgRx solution to certain problems might look like, and when would be the right timing for you to pick NgRx. So if I maximize this one, I don't see the timing, but it's okay, 1:15 p.m. for me right now, so I'm a bit earlier than you guys. So just have to look at the clock once in a while there. Okay, that's the title. You can connect with me on Twitter, like I just mentioned, at n_Mehlhorn, or on my website, Nils-Mehlhorn.de. That's too hard to type into the URL, but you can just Google for my book that Chung just mentioned, NgRx book. So I wrote a book based on my learnings on NgRx, where I go through all the main APIs of NgRx, the store solutions, how you can approach that. And we'll look into this on a bird's eye view here too. Yeah, questions at the end, like we just established, so just keep that in mind. And I'll just scroll down through here and just keep you in the loop on state management. So if you talk about state in Angular or in web applications or any applications in general, we're probably talking about stuff that can change in your application. So that could be some UI state, that could be user server state, which you want to synchronize with your client-side state. So anything that might change throughout the life cycle through your application, that's what you usually call state. And in modern web applications, there's a lot of state going around. You have state in different places, you have different kinds of state, and it can get hard to manage state. And what's mostly hard is updating state throughout the lifecycle of your application and synchronizing state between different places. And if we look at Angular, so I think the introduction to the talk was NgRx is what Redux is. NgRx is to Angular what Redux is to React. For my book and in general, I'm always researching what's the right timing to introduce tools to your stack. And usually, because Redux is such a concept from the React world, you tend to use the same arguments for introducing NgRx to Angular. But I think the story goes a bit different because there's already different tools for managing and synchronizing state in your Angular applications. And that's what the first illustration here is about. You can view this as some kind of hierarchy of your application. So at the top, that might be your app component, and these are different parts of your application that all have different local states. So, and this state has to be synchronized between these components in order to make your life easier, have state, don't have different versions of the same state. And in Angular, we already have different tools for that. And the main one would be I/O, so inputs, outputs. If you want to communicate between different components, you can use inputs and outputs through template bindings. I think you all know what I'm talking about. In order to have, imagine this component would manage a list of different entities like to-dos, and each of these lower components would be a specific to-do component, and you can bind a specific entity, some piece of state, into these presentational components down here in order to synchronize the state from the top component to the bottom component. And you can also go in the other direction. So if this if this presentational lower component changes something, maybe you check the to-do in your to-do list, you can propagate this to the parent via output bindings. And this way you can manage state alongside the view hierarchy of your application. So along the way you structured your application through components. And that's one way to keep state synchronized in your Angular applications. But we already, out of the box, have gotten a different mechanism, which is separate from the view hierarchy. So the thing is, if you only use input and output bindings, it's hard to connect components which are fundamentally located differently in your view hierarchy. Like if you want to synchronize this component over here with the one right on the other side of your application, if you want to say so, it's pretty hard because you have to go all the way to the top and then down there to your other component. And this would probably mess up your architecture. You'd have components in the middle like this one, which wouldn't care about about the state that's shared between this component and this one over here, and you'd pollute these components in the middle with the state. So this could be a navigation component, and this one would be like a little counter which says you've checked that many to-dos in your current session, and this one would be a specific to-do, and this way you could have this connection. But the thing is, Angular already has a different mechanism, so you don't have to do props drilling. That's a term for that, where you drill the props through your whole application, because we have services in Angular, and services are these state containers, if you want them to be state containers, which can be in the middle of your components, or rather outside of the view hierarchy, and offer you a different way to synchronize state between components without going all the way along the view hierarchy. And I think that's really powerful. And you can go a long way with these two tools in order to synchronize state and share state between different places of your application. So if you keep these in mind, these are great tools in order to structure your application, and developers tend to do with these really well. And if your requirements grow, you might look into things like RxJS-based services. So that would be the next step in this journey to NgRx on state management. And the next step you probably introduce is command query responsibility segregation, which I've practiced it. It's a really hard word, so I'll just call it NgRx from now on. And the idea here would be still sharing state between different components, but usually you do these through imperative calls to a service. And if you want to update some resource, you'd have to propagate these updates to different consumers in the view hierarchy, or different services which are interested in the same piece of state. And the way you facilitate this in Angular, or in software engineering in general, a pattern for this is NgRx, where you separate commands and queries for operating on data. So in Angular, we have the tool RxJS for that. And we can easily separate data based on this principle. We have a service which manages shared state, and it pushes data to a component. That would be the query part. So actually, in order not to have both arrows point in the same direction, usually the component would query the data from the service, and anytime the shared data changes, it's pushed to the component. And in turn, components can also work with this approach, because they always render when the data changes. If you think about on-push change detection in Angular, and then from your view, you can trigger updates to the state, or just like output bindings, event bindings. And you can pass these to the shared state container, your service, in order to execute commands on the data. So if you check the to-do I've mentioned earlier, that would be a command. And then the to-do updates in our like counter for the session that says you've checked so many to-dos in the current session would update in a completely different place of your application. So that's usually the next step if you face problems like I want to synchronize state between multiple places, and I don't want to constantly pull the data from the place where you share the state. So what we've done is we've transitioned from request response to a publish subscribed approach. So in a pull-based or request response approach, we'd have the service look like this. We've got the to-do service, and it has a method for updating some to-do. Like you could have a specific one for checking to-dos. We'll just have an update one. And this one also synchronizes the state, not just in the service itself, but it rather synchronizes the update of our to-do back to an HTTP API, and that one might lead to updating state in some database. So that's, I think, the main approach for writing services in Angular, where you just pass everything via HTTP to your server side. And then you see this pattern where you move to these reactive services, or services based on RxJS, where you can share or introduce or like transform your to-do service in some kind of into some kind of state container, which pushes the current state of your to-dos to your components via an RxJS observable. And I didn't implement the update to-do method here. We'll do it in the next step, but just so you can see this transition, or these both approaches for writing Angular services. And I think a lot of you have written both kinds of services. You can also use them in tandem. I think this is the next step you'd go to. And I've added a quote by Dan Abramov, who's the co-creator of Redux. So Redux, that would be the counterpart to NgRx in the React world. And he's written a great article on whether you need Redux or you don't. And in this, you'll find the quote, but if you trade something off, make sure you get something in return, which is kind of funny if you think about it, because this method returns something. This one doesn't. It's a void method. So I think it's quite fitting here if you go from request response to publish subscribe, from pull based to push based, you trade something off. Because on the left side, you can see that we get direct access to the result of this operation. We get an observable, which will eventually represent the updated entity from the server. And the problem here is this can only have a single consumer. So we could put some sharing operators on this observable and like share the operation, so we don't do too many HTTP requests or stuff like that. But usually you only have a single consumer, so just one component would trigger the update and no other component would get the result. And that's also the next problem here. You can't get updates from other sources. So if one component updates the to-do resource, other components won't notice. And we trade this again for the push-based approach, where we get updates from different sources, because we have this main observable which always pushes the most recent state of our to-dos. And this gives us multiple consumers because all components can subscribe to this shared observable. And if we update one to-do, it'll eventually update this observable at the top. We'll look into how we can do this in practice in a second. But what we don't get anymore is direct access to the result of the operation, because this one has to return a undefined or void in order to push the result through this shared observable. Quick look at the clock there. So I think both of these approaches are valid. So usually you'd start with the request response approach, and then if you face problems where you have to share state between different places, you move to the second one. But we'll talk about this in the big picture in the end. One thing I want to look into is if you go to the second abstraction where you have these push-based services, you got to watch out so you don't run into race conditions. So I've read a lot of blog posts where you can see this pattern, and it's laid out for you how you can implement this, and it probably looks something like the thing on the left, where you have this behavior subject, which is a specific observable which can retain state. In order to do that, it has to start with some state. So I'm putting an empty list in here. So this to-do service will manage an empty list of to-do entities. And then we expose this state in form of an observable over here. It's the to-do observable.
Interrupt you with a question?
Oh, do we want to put the questions towards the end, or is it just so foundational question?
Sander, what is it like related to the same thing here? So maybe we can do it now. That's fine.
Yeah, sure.
You are using a behavior subject here. Why aren't you using a replace subject? Because that doesn't need a default value, and it gets the first value from the first time you use it.
You can use both approaches, I think. But if you use a behavior subject, you can start it off with a value. I think that's really foundational. I'd have to think about this on a specific use case, but usually you see this pattern applied with the behavior subject. But I think a replace subject should work as well. So do you see any specific problems here with the behavior subject?
Well, a behavior subject really does need an initial value. And if your initial value comes from an HTTP request or somewhere else, you have this area where you need to put in something like an undefined and wrap up some special handling for that.
Yeah, the thing is, you'd have to do this at some place eventually anyway. So if we start off with a replace subject and a component subscribes before the HTTP request is done, that's providing the initial data. If that's the example you mentioned, you'd have to handle it in the component, right? So you have to like do some fallback for until this.
It doesn't
this
emit anything,
observable-
so the component will just wait for it.
Yes, it will just wait. So it has to render something in between. So it has to render some loading indicator. But sure, yeah, you can do both approaches, and yeah, maybe that might be easier in some cases. But you can also manage different states in here that signal to the component if you have loaded the initial values from the backend. But sure, yeah, that might be easier if you combine it with some NgIf directive in order to display some loading indicators. And here you don't know from the observable in itself if the data has been loaded from the backend. Yeah, that's correct. But I think both approaches work in this place. And the thing I'm getting to doesn't necessarily care if it's a behavior subject or a replace subject. So yeah, you can probably use both approaches. Otherwise, I invite you to discuss this in the Q&A afterwards. Okay. I don't see any cameras right now on my because my screen is too small, but I'll just put it on there. So we've got this observable behavior subject, replace subject, whatever you want for your specific case. And I'm not even fetching any initial data here, but yeah, usually you probably get some get all the to-dos from the backend here and push them through your subject in order to deliver your initial values to any subscribing component. But what I'm listing here is the specific method for updating a to-do. And the idea or the problem I'm trying to show you here is that you might introduce race conditions in your application by following this pattern for push-based services. And we get this from the side effect. So the HTTP request here would be the side effect. So that's not a bad thing. We need side effects in order to update any state. So a side effect is just something that will update state out of your current scope. So I'll just run with this definition for now. We update state that isn't like contained in this service itself. That's what I call a side effect. In this specific case, we update the database on our server. And we do this by issuing an HTTP put request on some API to-dos URL here, attaching the ID and the updated resource we want to send to the server. And then we just subscribe to this HTTP request. And once it gets back, we will update the current value of our behavior subject. We can do this because this behavior subject has this get value method. And that's something the replace subject doesn't have. So you'd have to orchestrate this differently if you want to use a replace subject here. The behavior subject offers this get value method, which will give us the current state of this behavior subject, so the list of the to-dos. And we'll just iterate through all these to-dos. And if we find the one that we just updated on the server side, we'll replace it with the updated one. And every other to-do will just stay the same through this immutable mapping operation I'm issuing here on the contained list of to-dos. And then once that's done, we emit the new state through our to-do subject, and any subscribing component can now update their state based on the now new state list of to-dos. And the problem we've introduced here is that we might run into a race condition here. And if you look into this, this update to-do method, that's actually our command from the CQRS pattern. And this above here, that's the query part, the observable we can query. And the problem with our command is that these can be issued like fast after each other. So we might have a mask, or we check this to do fast after each second you'll just switch the state of your to do. And this to the right, this is supposed to illustrate an HTTP request, or like two HTTP requests that are the result of this update to do method. And we can see that the first put operation on the to-dos API will start off. The browser will queue this into the HTTP middleware of your browser, and then it'll wait for the server to respond. And then at the end, it will download the updated resource. The thing is, if a second command, like another call to the update to do method, comes in before the first one is done and might even get executed faster. This might be because like the update you issued doesn't have to be propagated to a database, or just the network was just routed better for the second request than the first request. You might end up with ordering problems here. So the first request, which should be the one that should finish first, but if you look at the graph over here, the second one actually finishes first, and then you get the second one. So in the end, your server might be in state 2 here, but your client side might get the result of the first request after that. So in the end, your components won't be synchronized with your server state as well. And that's just because we've introduced this race condition, but just not handling the order of these HTTP requests explicitly. And if we want to do this, we can do it with NgRx. So I'll just scroll down here, and that should be the solution for the problem, or it's one solution for the problem. Quick glance at the clock here. Sorry about that. And so the idea is I've introduced another subject, and this subject is called update subject, and it's just a regular subject which will contain any updated to do. And anytime this subject emits a value, we will flatten this, or we will map it over to some HTTP request, and then flatten this HTTP request with a concat map operator from RxJS. What this will do is it will put our HTTP requests in order, actually. So the first HTTP request will be awaited to be completely done, and just once it is done, we will actually move on to the second HTTP request. And this will, like if you look into the documentation of concat map, it says it retains order of the inner observables. Our inner observable, that's the HTTP request in here. And by using concat map and this like workaround by going through another subject, which is basically some kind of event signal for updating a specific to-do, we can retain order, and we've mitigated this this problem with the race conditions. If you look down here, I'm just subscribing to the update observable, and anytime this one is done, so anytime one HTTP request is done, I just update the state like before. Like I've shortened this down here, and the command method just relates to a next call onto this update subject. And this is something you have to think about if you implement these kinds of pull-based reactive services. And this is also something the NgRx team has thought about. So if we think about how can we like extend this to multiple methods. So now you want to remove a to-do, you want to add a to-do, and you'd have to handle all of this for different operations on your to-dos. And you could do this either by introducing more subjects. So now we've got this update subject, and you might want to introduce a remove subject or something like this. Or you have different ways of updating to-dos, like check, uncheck, change the title in any way your API just allows this. And the approach A for handling more operations or extending this pattern would actually be introducing additional subjects, and that's something the NgRx component store library will do for you, or will help you with, because it's like a formalization of this kind of approach. And the main idea here is to mitigate race conditions. And it's called component store because I'm synchronizing the state between a specific set of components. It's not meant to be a global state in your application. Method B would be to abstract these operations into events. So if you think about it, I could have just one subject in here that's called like events, and I don't just issue a to-do through the next call in the update method, but I just wrap all of these operations into different types of events. I'll give them an identifier, and then at some place in the subscription or somewhere else, I can manage how these events are worked on by our state management. And that's actually the approach you will find if you look into NgRx store and NgRx effects. And that's what we'll look into now. The thing is, you can work with these services, and you can even work better probably with libraries like NgRx component store, or there's also Rx Angular state. That's a different library, but it's pretty much pretty similar to the idea of NgRx component store. And I'd really encourage you to look into it if you see yourself writing these services and fear about like introducing race conditions and you need this flattening. So then please look into these libraries. Maybe they'll give you some relief. And the problem with having lots of these reactive services is that things might get messy. This isn't inherent to the approach we've chosen. It's just writing lots of software tends to get messy. That's because if you share state between different services, between different components in I've called it service-oriented architecture, and that's a term you might find. Your application might look like this on a bird's eye level, where we have lots of commands going around, lots of data being pushed left and right. We might even have asynchronous communication between services. So you might have to do an HTTP request before you can update the state in another service. And so I've written this up to be messy. I've drawn this up to be messy. This isn't something where your application has to end up, and it isn't something that NgRx inherently solves, but it can help you solve this if you see yourself in this situation. But in general, this is how backend software, distributed systems specifically end up. And this is just to clarify, state management, synchronizing state is a complex topic, and NgRx offers one solution to mitigate this in Angular applications. And the solution would look like this. So just look at the drawing on the left here for now. The idea would be, we just don't have multiple services. We just have one service, and having just one service makes things easy because we just have to update the state in one place. Before we had services which had shared state. Now we just have one service which has global state, and we can still pull it's not pulled. It's actually pushed from the service to the component. So we subscribe to the global state, and in the other direction we can send events. So I've renamed this from events, from commands to events, because components or even services can now signal what has happened, and the service will decide how the state should be updated based on what has happened in the application. And I think this looks a bit cleaner than what I've drawn up above, but so this would be the NgRx store solution to like messy, or to like preventing this mess if you have the specific requirements for that, which I'm going into in a second there. Let's look at the code, how this can look. We have our Angular application. That's my app module here. And in order to introduce NgRx to your application, you'd import the store module from NgRx store. And you implement, you can import it for root, which just means it will register this service in your root application. So it's a global service which will manage the state for you. And you can already see there's something like a to-do reducer above. We'll look into this in a second, which just tells the store, this global service, how it should manage the state. And down here, I've written up the like the basic signature, or the both methods which are essential for this store abstraction from NgRx. And the idea is that it's a service and an injectable class which actually extends observable, so we can just subscribe to that. It's generic, so it will accept the shape of state which we need for our application. And then it has these two methods which actually relate pretty well to the NgRx pattern. We have the select method, which just is the counterpart to the subscribe we already get through the observable extension over here. And the idea here is just that we can tell the store that we are just interested in a specific slice of the state. But so you select state, and then you get an observable of a specific slice of the whole global state. So our to-do component might just be interested in to-dos, and if there's something else like authentication state also in NgRx, we don't have to look at that. And then there's this other method which is called dispatch, which relates to the command part of the CQRS, but I've named the parameter event because it's probably easier to structure bigger applications if you view these pieces, these they're actually called actions in NgRx as events instead of commands. So you don't tell the store what it has to do. You just tell the store what has happened in your whole application. And we can like specify these events, actions, how they are called in NgRx. I'll use these terms here interchangeably. In files like this, you see this is the to-do actions.typescript file. NgRx doesn't care about files, so you can put these anywhere you want. But usually you'd see them in files like this. And then we can define that we can use this method create action from NgRx store. And this way we can specify what kind of events can happen in our application. And these can actually contain also some payload. Specify this through this props method. And then we can say that there's some update to do action, and this action will actually have the payload of one to do. I won't go into the syntax here specifically because of like the time constraints, but I think you get the notion here that we can define two events. And then in some place where these events can occur, like our added to do component, we can use the we can inject the NgRx store buff here. You can see it imported from NgRx. And we can also import this method actually for creating a specific action instance. And if we call it with a specific to do down here, we get this action, put it in a variable, and then we can dispatch it to the store. And this way the store knows that something has happened. And what the store actually will do based on that is what you can see on the left side. Actions just drop into our application or into the store from any place in the application. So this could be like the click of submitting some form of your added to do component, or maybe the connection status has changed on HTTP request has returned. This can also be signalized to the store in terms of an action. And it will go into the store, and anytime the store receives an action, it will actually produce a whole new state. So this one goes from left to right and drops new states out of the store, and anytime this happens, all components which are subscribed will update. Quick look at the clock, already over, already at the end of the timing. So let's just look into these, the way how the store will update your whole application state. And this is where the reducer comes back in, which I've mentioned earlier. And this is like one function for telling the state, the store, how it can transform one action and one current state into one new state. So I've drawn this up in form of like a funnel, and there you drop in the current state, one action, which is sent by our component. And then you can calculate a new state without any interference from outside and get this next state. And this is how the code for this would look like. And you can see, I'll go into the syntax here again, but you can see embedded in this is our code from before, from the Reactive service, where I can just say all to-dos are mapped to either the same to-do they already are, or our updated to-do, which might get back through our action, which is dispatched either from our added to-do component or maybe from a network request that has been returned. And then I'll skip this part for now, but these are some specific ways for selecting different slices of the state. But I think we can work with the store really well. If you just think it's an observable, we can select specific slices, and then we will only receive updates from the state. So just look at the top one for this right now. If this is our whole state, we might just be interested in this triangle over here. We can select it through the select method I've just shown you in the store, and then we will only get an observable which always pushes this triangle to our components. So just glance over the next one here. One last important piece of the whole NgRx solution is that at this point we haven't seen HTTP requests in this whole setup and code on the right side. And the idea how we can put HTTP requests back into the NgRx approach is that we basically don't. So we already have this cycle where we update the state based on actions, and we don't need to modify that in order to bring back HTTP requests. We can just model the success or failure or just the completion of HTTP or any asynchronous operation by modeling these via events. So if you look at the illustration on the left side, we have this update action event, whatever you want to call it at this point. And this might trigger some HTTP requests. You've submitted the edit to do component form, and this would trigger an async HTTP request in form of the HTTP client by Angular. Once it is done, which you can see through subscribing to it, and then once the onNext callback is called, we emit a different action to the store, which we could call update success. We've defined this in the actions file earlier, or we might even have a different action which signalizes that this operation has failed. And this is the way how you could model this in NgRx effects. We actually have a different class here now, which starts off with an actions service, which we inject over here. And the actions service, I've marked it with this $sign over here. It's actually an observable, which just represents every action that is dispatched in our whole application. And then we also inject the HTTP client in here. And then we can go ahead and construct this little drawing from the left in terms of RxJS. So we'd start off with the event bus or action bus from our whole application. Then there's an operator called offType, which just filters the whole event stream, the whole action stream based on one update to do action. And if this occurs, we go back to the ideas we already have from the reactive service, where we flatten all these commands, but we've moved to events, to inner observables, inner HTTP requests via the content map operator. Once that's done, we go back to mapping the update to our update to do success, or our success event from over here. And that's something the store can again understand, and NgRx will actually subscribe to this observable over here. And any action which falls out of it will be sent back to the store. The store will produce another state. So that's the old circle. We've implemented the reactive store from the beginning in terms of NgRx. I've also drawn up a marble diagram. Maybe I can show this afterwards if there are, if we want to go into the effects even more, how this observable looks in form of marble diagrams. But let's end up here. This is the whole NgRx cycle, store and effects combined. And that's the whole NgRx concept. And in the center, you can see the store. And components can actually be updated based on the store, and components can dispatch actions to the store. Once actions reach the store, they will be funneled through this reducer in combination with the current state, and the next state will drop out of it and again update the components, and we get the cycle where we can continuously update the state with these different pieces. And we can also attach effects which are asynchronous side effects, which don't interfere with our actual state calculation by triggering these based on actions. And they can talk to services like the HTTP client. And once they're done, they can again dispatch actions back to the store and notify the success of an HTTP request or something like that. And the state can update based on that. Our component can subscribe, and the to-do list will always be in sync. So that's the NgRx approach. You can see there are you can find the same ideas from reactive services from before. We've managed race conditions, but we've also transitioned from request response to publish subscribe, and we've also transformed commands into events. So these are the two steps we have to take in order to leverage NgRx. And the last slide I've got for you is this one, where I'm just listing some pros and cons, or how to think about NgRx, or what I've come to think about NgRx after using it in applications, writing a book about it. And there are some things which get easier with NgRx, which would be I've put this into a parenthesis, which is sharing data between components. This is something that doesn't really apply to Angular because you already have services, so I've put this into parentheses. And the next one, which gets easier or might get easier, is tracing what has happened, because these events are easily traceable. There's also some developer tooling where you can, or great developer tooling where you can trace what has happened in your application, how different actions have changed your global application state. And also attaching new components and effects is really easy because you just have to pull these marbles a bit further and just inject something in the middle and subscribe to certain actions, to certain slices of state. And this really eases up coupling between different parts of the application. And I've also put testing, which might be debatable, but because you have these specific parts, the reducer effects, these are easily testable. Doesn't mean that you can't reach this with a service-oriented architecture. There are also some things which get harder with NgRx, like correlating events. So we've had this update to do action, and we've got this update to do success action. And it's a bit hard to know that these belong together. So if we go back to a specific component, the update to do component, which submits a form, it's initially a bit hard to know when the submission is done. So things like loading indication or stuff like that tends to get hard in the beginning when you use NgRx. So you keep that in mind. What's also hard is releasing obsolete state, because the state isn't bound to a specific component like you'd have if you use the component store. You have to really think about when can I release this state if I go to a specific page. So NgRx is really meant for global state, whatever that specifically is. And what also is hard is like representing large server-side states. What I usually mean by this is pagination. So if you want to display like a long list of something which you have sliced into server-side pages, this tends to get hard if you want to represent it with NgRx. So the takeaways I want to give you are specifically for NgRx. I'll just zoom this in a bit further here. You should definitely try it. So give it a try, get to know the API, get to know the tool, get to know when it might help you. And then you might consider it for global state, which is state that is used in most of your app, like authentication state. But even if you talk about authentication state, that might not be, you might have applications where it's not even used in your whole application. So tread carefully and don't just put anything into the NgRx store, because like the things that get harder, they will come at you, correlating events and stuff like that. And specifically, you don't have to use it. You can rely on the built-in tools of Angular. And specifically, I like to say that if you just want caching for HTTP requests or stuff like that, don't use NgRx for that. So you can cache some stuff in NgRx, but maybe you want to try HTTP cache first, or specific libraries like Cache by NgNeat or RxQuery from one of the NgRx maintainers, actually. And for state management in general, some takeaways from my perspective is start by recognizing that this can be a complex problem, synchronizing states, managing states, not running into race conditions. That's hard. That's just a general problem with software engineering, and not something that some tool will come around and solve for you by itself. But you should try different solutions so you know what you've got in your tool belt. So please try NgRx, try the component store, try the store in itself. And in general, you might want to prefer local state. That's preferably without race conditions, because you don't have these problems you might get if you reach for global state anytime. And one thing I've added to the list recently is I've implemented a checkout for a marketplace software, and I didn't use NgRx. So we're actually using React there, but I didn't use Redux as well. And I used state machines, actually, or state charts, specifically Xstate, the library, if you also want to look into this. So if you see yourself implementing state machines for like critical client-side behaviors that shouldn't get out of sync, please take a look at state machines instead of reaching for NgRx, which is kind of a state machine, but not really. So yeah, state machines really allow you to prevent illegal state. That's something that's a bit harder to do with NgRx itself. So I think I'm far over the time by now, but that would be from my side. And thank you so much. And we can go into the Q&A part.
Thanks, Neil. That's very interesting. You want to come back and talk about Xstate in the future?
Yeah, sure. I'm just getting used to it, so I might not be the perfect person for that by now, but yeah, I'll keep it in mind.
Sure, thanks. I think this on top of the hour, but we can always stay for another 10 minutes if you don't mind. Yeah. So
Yeah, I can say.
sure. So the first one is Sander. All right, go ahead, Sander.
Hi. Can you explain to me what is the problem NgRx is solving?
The problem would be initially one thing you can see on the left side is sharing state between different and loosely coupled parts of your application. What you also get is decoupling commands from queries. So the problem you would be solving is you don't have to know which parts of your application you have to update once any event in your application occurs, because NgX
That's
will,
why you need the dev tools.
yeah, you need the dev tools in order to trace what has happened. So you don't need them, but they make things easier because you can trace these events have happened in your application. And this is how they influence the state. And at the same time, what NgX will do for you is like a bunch of components can be subscribed to your whole state and they will automatically update. And they don't have to actually know what has happened in the background. So that's the idea.
Yeah. What I don't get is that in history we have been learning that global state is a thing we should avoid at all cost.
Yes.
And then NgRx comes along and puts almost everything in a global state. I'm not sure I know how to balance this.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's something I wanted to emphasize here too. So I don't really. So that's definitely something you should be careful with. You shouldn't put everything into global state, or like let's define global state. It's your browser application. So there's really no things as real global state because our world is inherently distributed. But yeah, inside your application, you put everything into one place, and yeah, that's something historically, or you probably learn that's a bad thing. But it makes some things easier, and that's the trade-off you're using with NgX, because it makes it easier to synchronize between different places because you just have one place where you can synchronize stuff. And yeah, so that's the trade-off. In general, yeah, that's why I said prefer local state. But for things which are nearly global, like authentication state or your settings of your application and stuff like that, which are used in many places and might update from many places, you can use this NgX Redux trade-off of using global state in your application. And in order to keep global state manageable, at the same time you go the second way, you make the second adjustment of not using any commands, but using these events and updating state only in this funnel in the middle. But in general, I agree with you, and I want to emphasize this too.
Thank you.
You can have many different stores though per application. So you can have one store for a group of components. So it's not exactly global, is it?
It is technically, but you can just to be specific there, you can not have multiple stores. You can just have one store in one application.
Oh, okay.
You might hack around and add multiple stores, but what you can do is separate your store into different features. That's what you usually do in NgX. But in the end, they're always global. So you can scope these to your Angular modules, and they will actually be lazy loaded, and you won't have them everywhere initially. But once your Angular module is loaded, it won't be cleaned up. If you root away from your application, you'd have to do this yourself. So every state in NgX is eventually global, but you can manage this through NgX features, and different reducers. You just don't have this one funnel, but you can just have multiple funnels for these different pieces of your state.
Right. So I'm sure I've done it in the past, but I don't know if I have. So when I create two different stores, it's actually just creating one store and kind of doing things behind the scenes.
Yes. That's exactly what's happening. So you can import this. I've been at this store import at the top. I'll just scroll back to that. This is where you start. And I've imported the store module.forRoot and I've passed this like part for managing to-dos in the store. And you can also import the store module as for feature, like you do with Angular routing. And there you can actually pass additional reducers and define additional slices of state, but they will end up in the same global state service you can see to the left. You can just register them lazily.
Right, yeah, cool, thanks.
Sure.
I think Eileen had a question. Can you unmute and just go ahead with the question, Eileen?
Oh, yeah, okay. So I was just wanted to ask, should we use NgRx for services, especially if we need to update our UI after we get the API responses?
Yes, I didn't get the first part. So we have to update our components after the API response. We can do this through effects.
But it requires me to, listen to like all the actions, and it feels like I feel like I'm adding a lot more code when I do it.
So you can your components will actually be updated because they are subscribed to the service. So if you look into this here, we've got this component which is subscribed to the service. So you can just have one component which is only subscribed, and another component will send an event. And this event will actually be funneled through an NgRx effect in order to complete the HTTP request. And once that's done, the update that will occur based on the HTTP request will also be pushed to the component. So if we go down here, and you can see the reducer, which will update the state, it listens for a specific action. Here it listens for the update to do action, but we can also make it listen to the update to do success action. And this way, we'd only update the state and replace our to do with the updated to do from the HTTP request once the HTTP request is done. And anytime we produce a next state based on an action, the any component which is subscribed to this part of the state will update because it's subscribed to an observable, which will just push a new value. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think I will have to think about it a bit more so. But yeah, thanks for your answer.
Sure, you're welcome. You can reach out to me if you want to ask further later on.
Yep, yeah, thank you.
I'll send some link on the chat. You wanted to follow Neil on
Yeah,
on
I'll
Twitter?
have to go over here then. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, so I think Teddy is raising hands. Teddy, can you go ahead?
Yeah, I have a question. If services are not involved, then do we still use NgRx to pass information around different components?
If services are not involved,
yeah, do we still use NgRx?
So NgRx in itself it's a service, right? So if we look at it up here, so that's basically the store. So it's marked as injectable, so it's a service. And could you describe a situation where services are not involved? So if you have this like to-do list component and it has different, it has single, there's a component for a single to-do, and you pass a single to-do from the to-do list component to a specific to-do component. That would be something like that?
Yeah. I was referring to, let's say I don't call any APIs, but maybe let's say I just want to pass this information from one component to another component in another page. Is it recommended to use NgRx?
Yes, I would actually separate this from HTTP requests. You can so the basic NgRx solution, if you look down here, you can actually just remove this part, and this is still the whole NgRx library and doesn't have any HTTP requests. So if you have a use case where there are many components which will update something that looks like global state, and it has to be pushed to many different places in your application, whether this will trigger an HTTP request in the background or not, you could still reach for NgRx. Probably, I wouldn't recommend it. So you'd have to look at the specific use case, but usually NgRx makes things easier where you have lots of these effects, and lots of places where actions can occur. And this could be some WebSockets, some HTTP requests, something you write into your storage, some sensory input from the browser. Usually that's where NgX makes things easier. But technically, you don't have to do HTTP requests if you want to use NgX. And I'd encourage you to try it out and implement an application where you don't have HTTP requests and just like work around it.
Right. So is it standard like industrial practice? Yeah.
So I'm always a bit careful with standard industrial practice. So a lot of enterprises are using NgX. You can see this by installing the or Redux. You can see this by installing the DevTools, and then a lot of web pages where you go, you can see them light up, and you can actually see how any big companies are managing their state. So it is done by enterprises, but just because you're doing HTTP requests, you don't have to use NgX at all. So you can just use the Angular HTTP client, and in many cases, it's easier to use this request response based approach. And just later on, if you see yourself in a mess that looks like the one I've drawn up above, where you've got lots of services and lots of places where actions or commands can occur, and you have to think about what should update if something occurs, then you might reach for NgX to simplify this. But yeah, yes to the answer. It's probably enterprise practice. If it is best practice, you should probably decide for a specific use case. And I'd always encourage you to start with local state, start with less tooling. And then if you see that things get out of hand, like reflect at specific points in your project, look into the problems they're facing and how this might be solved by concepts, and then look into libraries that implement these concepts like NgX, or maybe state machines or NgX component store. Yeah. So if you see that you only have to synchronize the state between some components, you probably should reach for the NgX component store by now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
All right. Yeah. I'd also encourage you to look at the NgX documentation for the component store. There's actually a comparison of both solutions, and you can use them at your will, and even combine both. So you can have some parts of your application which are used by the component store, and then you think, all right, authentication gets a bit messy, and we've got lots of places where things can update. So we might move this into some NgX store. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that if you wanted to look for an application that you both component store and the global store, I send you my repository.
That's so cool. Yeah.
You see the Spotify, yeah, still the one. I'm using both. This was just trying like experiment my stuff. Yeah. So basically you try it out.
You're implementing Spotify. Yeah, I still have to look at the source code for that. It looks so cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
How did you decide on using on which state management to use in there, or was it just for showcasing things?
No, actually, it's like at the beginning I thought of only using component store, and then gradually I found that there's some part of the like data, like state, need to be available anyway. So when you use component store, when you make it injectable root, it just acts as a global store like state anyway. But
yes,
it doesn't look like, because there's only one service and it's just getting too long. That's why I start to introduce the global store into it.
And what parts of data did you use it for, if I may ask?
I think there was a caching that you just mentioned.
So I think
and
there's
authentication.
Authentication, probably that's the first one people usually mention, and caching. I think this is like this looks promising in the beginning if you start making HTTP requests through NgX, but if you get into these specific use cases, I usually see myself, or I see people who are using NgX, they tend to use NgX as an HTTP cache, and I think that's in many cases overly complicated, but I don't know your specific requirements there. And you can do lots of things based on that. So in some places it's probably helpful too.
Yeah, thanks. I need to look into it, but yeah, also a showcase anyway. So there's more stuff
So you can do it, but I see a lot of people who see this and something goes off and they think, oh, this looks like I don't have to do that many HTTP requests anymore. And then in the end, it's more HTTP requests than ever before because your effects don't work really well and you have to do lots of work in order to keep things synchronized. And at that point, you might want to look at the solutions I've mentioned, like the Cashew library or Rx Query, which is a perfect project, but a really nice project by Tim Deschriver, one of the NgX maintainers, actually.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll look into it. I think I saw teamwork before. And anyway, anyone has any question? Because we are like after 15 minutes and Neil is still staying. So if you still have one question, we have 1 more minute to go. Go ahead. If not, I'll see you on September or when Nils come back and talk about Extet.
We see about that.
Oh,
curious to know how you guys test this stuff. I can go into this for a second. So if you look at these parts, they are actually pretty decoupled. So testing them is easier than you might think. So this reducer function, which we create, I'll have to scroll around somewhere here, which we create over here, that is eventually just a function which accepts 2 parameters, and you can test it in isolation. So you can see this exports a constant called to do reducer, and in the end, it's just a function which will accept the initial state or your type of state, which here that's just a list of to-dos, and any action which you define in some of these on cases, which are just like switch case blocks, just a different API. And so you can have a test case where you prepare both of these inputs, throw them into the to-do reducer by invoking this function, and then you assert that the next state that comes out of it is correct. So this part is pretty easy to test. The other part would be like integration testing, where you spin up a couple components, spin up the store, and make sure that when you dispatch this action and this action, the component should display this in the end. So that's a different part you can test, and something you can also test in isolation are these effects down here. So this effect is an RxJS observable in the end. It's a property update $. So this the Finnish notation, and it's bound to the to-do effects service class. And you can test this in an Angular unit test where you spin up a test bed and insert some mock for this actions event observable and use the HTTP testing module, or you could move this HTTP calls actually to another service so it's easier mocked. And then you can test these how you test any RxJS observable in Angular, which in itself is like a complex topic, but you use asynchronous Jasmine tests, or you can use Marble testing. Actually, both approaches are outlined in detail in my book if you want to look into this. But you can also find like free input on this, and there's also information on this in the official documentation.
Yep. Thanks, Neil. I think, okay, I will conclude today's meetup. I think people, like every one of us, can stay there for 1 hour and have more questions to go. But once again, let's conclude it here. Thank Neil for joining today and spend until the very end. But I think people were staying also until very end, which means that your talk is high quality. Thumbs up.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And
Thank you, Nils.
For everyone, thank all of you also have been staying up with us until the end. And I'll see you on September. I will post more stuff onto Twitter, and then I will post also the recorded talk for today in a couple of hours. See you guys on September then. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you.